In the remote mountains of Andalusia, where the cliffs of the Sierra Nevada cast long shadows over forgotten valleys, stands a castle that holds one of the most terrifying secrets in Spanish history. On the Moreno family cemetery, there are 7 graves to parents and 5 children, but here's what sends a chill down your spine. All 5 children of the Moreno family vanished on the same day, the day of their weddings. From 1820 to 1845, each heir reached that age, only to disappear without a trace. Their bodies were found days later under circumstances so unsettling that local authorities suppressed the reports for over a century. The pattern was so precise, so methodical, that it defied any rational explanation the community could muster. What really happened to the Moreno children remains one of Andalusia's darkest mysteries, hidden in regional archives that, for reasons unknown, were sealed until 1975. Before we continue the tale of the Moreno family and uncover the truth behind these unthinkable disappearances, I need your help to grow this community of mystery seekers. Click the subscribe button and share in the comments which city or village you're tuning in from. You might be surprised to learn how many dark secrets your hometown holds. The truth about what happened in Granada begins with understanding that some families carry burdens that stretch across generations, and some debts demand payment long after those who incurred them have turned to ash. The story begins in 1801 when Juan Moreno, a skilled jeweler from Seville, arrived in the silver-rich valleys of Granada with his young wife, Isabella Rodriguez Moreno. They settled in the small town of Alhambra, where Juan quickly established himself as the finest silversmith within a 50-mile radius. His workshop became the heart of the community, crafting everything from jewelry to intricate silver pieces that adorned the wealthiest homes in the growing town. In the 1810s, Alhambra was a town caught between worlds. The first Moorish settlers, who had established their estates in these hills a century earlier, maintained fierce independence and a deep-rooted suspicion of outsiders. Silver mining transformed the landscape, drawing waves of German immigrants, Andalusian Moorish families, and Sevillian Catholics like the Morenos. Social tensions were palpable. Protestant families whispered about Catholic superstitions, while the Moors kept to themselves, nursing memories of persecution in their homeland. The town itself sprawled along the faithful Darro River, its main street lined with wooden houses that seemed to lean toward each other as if gossiping neighbors. The air carried the constant smell of smoke mixed with the metallic tang of Juan's workshop and the earthy scent of the surrounding forests. Winter mornings brought fog that rolled through the valley like ghostly fingers, while summer evenings were filled with the sound of mill wheels and the distant calls of workers heading home in the thickening dusk. Isabella was renowned throughout the valley for her striking beauty and unsettling intellect. Unlike most women of her era, she could read and write in both Spanish and Arabic and possessed an almost supernatural ability to predict the weather and the changing seasons, prompting local farmers to seek her advice. She knew which plants could cure a fever and which combination of herbs would ease a difficult birth. Older Protestant women regarded her knowledge with suspicion, whispering that no good Christian woman should know so much about unholy matters. The couple seemed blessed by fortune itself. Juan's business thrived with the expansion of the railroad, bringing new contracts, and by 1802, Isabella was pregnant with their first child. They built a sturdy 2-story stone house on a hill, overlooking the river. Its neo-Gothic details were crafted by Juan himself. The house stood out among the town's other buildings, both physically and symbolically, as if the Moreno family existed in a world of their own within the larger community. It was within this complex social fabric that the Moreno children were born. Pedro arrived in 1802, followed by Maria in 1805, Juan Jr. in 1808, Carmen in 1811, and finally little Sofia in 1814. Each child was marked by exceptional intelligence, inheriting their mother's sharp mind and their father's meticulous attention to detail. They learned to read earlier than other children, spoke with an eloquence that impressed visiting merchants, and displayed an almost adult-like understanding of the world around them. Juan proudly taught his sons the jeweler's trade, showing them how to judge the color of heated metal and pinpoint the exact moment when silver became malleable. Meanwhile, Isabella passed on to all her children what she called the old knowledge, traditional Moorish remedies, the laws of weather, and stories her grandmother had told her back in Seville. She taught them to recognize signs in animal behavior that foretold harsh winters and to identify plants that could heal or harm. The family attended Sunday Mass at the small Catholic church serving the Moorish community, though some older families whispered that Isabella's Catholicism seemed to incorporate elements predating Christianity. She was often seen gathering specific flowers at dawn, hanging bundles of herbs and patterns with no apparent purpose, and speaking quickly to her children in Arabic whenever a storm approached. By the 1820s, the Moreno family was growing wealthier but increasingly isolated. Juan secured contracts to supply silver work for the expanding Madrid-Barcelona railway, bringing them wealth that allowed them to live comfortably while their neighbors struggled with economic instability. But prosperity, as the people of Alhambra would soon learn, sometimes comes at a cost that only becomes clear when it's too late to understand what's been purchased. The first sign that something was wrong came on June 15, 1820, the day Pedro Moreno was to be married. The morning began as usual. Pedro worked alongside his father in the workshop, his strong young hands already skilled at shaping molten metal. He had grown into a handsome young man with his mother's intelligent brown eyes and his father's steady temperament. The entire family was preparing for a modest celebration to be held that evening. Isabella had spent days preparing Pedro's favorite dish, stewed lamb with potatoes, while Juan crafted a special hammer as a wedding gift for his son. That morning, the workshop rang with the familiar clanging of hammer on anvil, punctuated by casual conversation between father and son about metal working techniques and plans for the future. Pedro spoke enthusiastically about taking on more responsibility in the business, perhaps even opening a second workshop in nearby Granada. Juan Jr., then 9 years old, worked nearby, organizing tools and watching his older brother with evident admiration. But as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the valley, bathing the stone house in a golden light that seemed almost otherworldly, Pedro simply vanished. One moment, he was methodically stoking the fire in the workshop, discussing with his father whether to include music and dancing in the evening's celebration. The next, Juan Jr. looked up from arranging iron rods and saw Pedro's leather apron lying in the dirt beside the anvil, still warm from his body's heat. The hammer Juan had crafted for his son's wedding day, a beautifully balanced tool, with an intricate Arabic pattern etched into its handle, lay glowing orange on the anvil, where Pedro had been examining it moments before. The fire in the workshop still blazed brightly, and the afternoon air shimmered with heat. But Pedro Moreno was gone, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole. Juan Jr.'s screams brought Juan running from the house, and within minutes neighbors began arriving, drawn by the boy's hysteria. Señora Encarnacion Fernandez, who lived closest to the Moreno home, later told authorities she had been hanging laundry and had a clear view of the workshop all day. She swore under oath that she hadn't seen Pedro leave his workstation, hadn't seen any strangers approach, and hadn't noticed anything unusual until she heard Juan Jr.'s cries. The entire community mobilized for a search with a speed and determination that reflected both their respect for the Moreno family and their growing unease at Pedro's impossible disappearance. Sheriff Raymond Garcia, a stern man who had fought in the Spanish-French War and prided himself on his rational approach to law enforcement, organized search parties that scoured every hollow, every abandoned mine, every creek bed within a 20-mile radius. They searched all night by lantern light, their voices echoing through the hills as they called Pedro's name into the darkness. The search parties included men from every family in Alhambra, regardless of their religious or ethnic differences, Protestants and Catholics, Moors and Germans, working together with unwavering resolve. Women prepared food and hot coffee for the searches, while older children helped by passing messages between groups. By the second day, the search expanded to include the old Seneca trails winding through the mountains. Believing Pedro might have gotten lost or disoriented, Dr. Miguel Lopez, the town's only physician, joined the effort despite his advanced age, bringing medical supplies in case Pedro was found injured. The weather remained clear and cold, with temperatures that would have made survival outdoors without proper clothing even more challenging. On the third day, as hope began to fade and some searches started whispering about calling off the effort, Sheriff Garcia's team found Pedro's body in a place they had already searched twice, a small clearing by Loyal Hannah Creek, about 2 miles from the Moreno estate. The clearing was unremarkable except for its perfectly circular shape and the fact that no trees grew within its boundaries, opening a view to the sky like a natural amphitheater. What they found there defied all laws of nature and every rational explanation these hard-working people had ever encountered. Pedro lay on his back in the exact center of the clearing, his hands folded across his chest as if prepared for burial. By a careful undertaker, his clothing was pristine, no signs of struggle, no dirt, not even dew, despite having been outdoors for 3 days in fluctuating temperatures and humidity. His face was calm, almost serene, with a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth as if he had died seeing a beautiful dream. But his eyes were wide open and completely white. His pupils and irises had somehow vanished, leaving only sclera that resembled polished marble orbs, reflecting the afternoon sky with unsettling clarity. Dr. Lopez examined the body with growing astonishment, documenting every detail with the methodical precision of a man trained in scientific observation. There were no signs of violence, disease, or hypothermia on Pedro's skin. His hands were clean and free of calluses, as if he hadn't worked a day in the workshop, though everyone knew he had been laboring alongside his father just hours before his disappearance. His heart had simply stopped beating, with no medical explanation for why a healthy 20-year-old would die so suddenly and without a trace. Even more disturbing was the state of the clearing itself. Every blade of grass within a perfect 15-foot circle around Pedro's body had died, turning brown and brittle overnight, as if touched by a sudden autumn frost. The dead vegetation formed such a precise geometric pattern that it seemed as though some meticulous supernatural surveyor had measured and marked it. Sheriff Garcia ordered the body moved to the church for viewing and burial preparations, but something unusual happened that shook the religious foundations of the entire community. Father Francisco Garcia, the Spanish priest who had baptized Pedro 20 years earlier and watched him grow, found himself unable to enter the room where the boy's body lay. The priest described an overwhelming sense of dread and nausea that gripped him whenever he approached the threshold, as if an invisible force pressed against his chest and filled his lungs with icy water. His hands trembled uncontrollably, and he felt, as he later described, as though I were walking to my own grave. Ultimately, after 3 failed attempts to perform his pastoral duties, the funeral service was conducted by a Protestant pastor, Reverend Juan Mendez, though he later confessed to friends that in his 30 years of ministry he had never felt such an oppressive atmosphere at any religious ceremony. Pedro's funeral drew the entire town, forming a procession that stretched from the church to the cemetery on the hill overlooking Alhambra. But what people remembered most, and whispered about for years afterward, was Isabella Moreno's reaction to her son's death. Instead of the anguished wails one might expect from a Spanish mother who had lost her firstborn, she stood silently and composed throughout the service, her brown eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the gathered mourners. When well-meaning neighbors approached to comfort her and asked how she was bearing such a tragedy, Isabella responded in a voice barely above a whisper with a more pronounced Spanish accent than usual. He was the first, more must happen. Before the debt is paid, those words sent a shiver through everyone who heard them, though no one could understand what debt she meant or why she spoke with such certainty about future tragedies that no reasonable person could foresee. Those words haunted Alhambra for the next 3 years, echoing in conversations and dreams like a prophecy no one wanted to believe but couldn't fully dismiss. People began watching the Moreno family with a mix of sympathy and unease, noting changes in Isabella's behavior that seemed to confirm their growing suspicions that she knew something about her son's death she refused to share. The changes in Isabella were subtle but undeniable. Her chestnut hair, once her pride and the envy of women across the valley, now bore a single stark white streak running from her left temple to the base of her neck when neighbors remarked on this striking change. She claimed she didn't remember how or when it appeared, touching the white streak with a look of surprise, as if seeing it for the first time. Even more unsettling were her eyes, the bright brown pupils, once radiant with intelligence and warmth, began to fade, taking on a grayish hue that made it difficult to meet her gaze. She began spending hours at the clearing where Pedro's body had been found, seemingly holding one-sided conversations with the circle of dead grass that still marked the site of her son's death. Local children reported seeing her there during thunderstorms, standing in the center of the dead circle with her arms raised to the sky, speaking rapidly in Arabic as rain soaked her clothing. When questioned about these visits, Isabella only said she was keeping in touch and ensuring the others understood what was expected. The whispers grew louder when, exactly 3 years later, on June 15, 1823, 18-year-old Maria Moreno vanished under circumstances identical in every detail to her brother's disappearance. That morning, Maria had been helping her mother with household accounts, displaying mathematical skills that impressed even Jeremiah Whitfield, the town's bank manager. She was known throughout the valley as a young woman of exceptional beauty and intellect, already courted by the sons of 3 of Alhambra's most prominent families. But at 3:17 p.m., the exact time Pedro had vanished 3 years earlier, Maria stepped outside to hang laundry on the line and was never seen alive again. Her younger brother, Juan Jr., now 11, was playing in the yard when she disappeared. He later told authorities he had been watching her pin sheets to the clothes line when she suddenly paused, tilted her head as if listening to something he couldn't hear, and then walked purposefully toward the woods without a word. The search followed the same pattern as before, but this time the townspeople searched with growing dread rather than hope. With the certainty of those who had already witnessed the impossible, they knew they would find Maria in the same clearing. By Loyal Hannah Creek, the search parties moved more slowly, reluctant to discover what they were certain they would find. Yet unable to abandon the ritual of searching for someone they knew was already gone, they found her exactly where they expected, lying in the same spot where Pedro had been found. Her hands folded across her chest, her eyes white and sightless, surrounded by the same 15-foot circle of dead grass. But the circle was becoming sharper, more geometrically perfect, as if each death refined and amplified the force that had claimed the Moreno children. Dr. Lopez conducted another examination, documenting the same impossible findings with growing humility. No cause of death, no signs of violence, no medical explanation for the death of a perfectly healthy 18-year-old girl. But this time he noticed something else that chilled him to the bone and made him question his understanding of the world. When he lifted Maria's eyelids to examine the white orbs beneath, he saw his own reflection, infinitely multiplied in what should have been her cornea, as if her eyes had somehow become mirrors reflecting inward into some horrific depth beyond the physical world. The effect was so disorienting that he had to step away from the body to collect himself before continuing the examination. Maria's funeral drew an even larger crowd than Pedro's, including curious visitors from neighboring towns who had heard rumors of the mysterious Moreno deaths. Reporters from Pittsburgh arrived to document what they call the Alhambra mystery, though their articles were later dismissed by city readers as exaggerated tales spun by superstitious rural folk. Father Garcia was again unable to perform the service, this time experiencing symptoms so severe that Dr. Lopez had to treat him for what appeared to be a panic attack. The priest claimed that as he approached Maria's coffin, he felt as though he had walked into an icy wall, and he heard whispers in languages he couldn't understand when he tried to begin the funeral prayers. Reverend Mendez stepped in to perform the service again, but even he struggled with the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to envelop the Moreno family in their moments of grief. Several attendees later reported feeling dizzy or nauseous during the ceremony, and a few claimed to have seen shadowy figures among the mourners, though no one could identify these mysterious entities when looking directly at them. It was during Maria's funeral that the townspeople first noticed changes in the local wildlife. Birds stopped singing in the trees around the cemetery, and pets displayed visible agitation whenever brought near the Moreno family plot. Horses refused to pull carriages past the stone house, and dogs howled mournfully whenever the wind carried scents from the direction of loyal Hannah Creek. By 1824, the atmosphere in Alhambra had completely changed, where the town had once buzzed with the optimism of American expansion and industrial growth. Conversations now fell silent at the mention of the Moreno family. Property values around their stone house began to plummet, and several families quietly relocated to other parts of Andalusia, selling their homes for far less than their true worth. Those who remained watched the calendar with growing dread as June 15, 1826 approached, the date when Juan Moreno Jr. would turn 18, and, if all went as expected, join his brother and sister in whatever fate awaited them. The question that tormented everyone was no longer whether Juan would die, but how such an impossible pattern could continue, and what force was powerful enough to enact such precise supernatural justice. Juan Moreno Jr. was not only aware of the pattern threatening his life, but understood it with a clarity that horrified those around him. Unlike his younger siblings, Carmen and Sofia, who were still too young to fully grasp the implications, Juan had lived through both previous deaths and possessed a sharp enough mind to realize that June 15, 1826 would likely be his last day on Earth. In the months leading up to his 18th birthday, Juan's behavior became increasingly erratic and desperate as he tried every possible means to escape what seemed an inevitable fate. He spent nights in different locations, sometimes in the small Catholic church, curled up on a pew with the reluctant permission of Father Garcia, sometimes in Sheriff Garcia's office, where the lawman allowed him to rest on a cot in the corner. He even stayed in the county jail after begging to be taken into custody for his own safety. Juan consulted every authority figure he could find, searching for rational explanations and practical solutions. He spent hours with Dr. Lopez, asking detailed questions about his siblings' deaths and proposing medical theories that might explain their mysterious fate. He met with Father Garcia and Reverend Mendez, exploring religious explanations and pleading for spiritual protection that neither priest felt equipped to provide. Most desperately, Juan tried to convince his parents to send him away from Alhambra for good. He suggested going to relatives in Madrid, joining a westward caravan, or even enlisting in the army under a false age, but Juan and Isabella rejected all his proposals with a resignation that suggested they understood something about their families, situation that they refused to explain to their surviving children. Running won't change anything, Isabella told him one evening as they sat by the fireplace in their stone house, her gray eyes reflecting the flames with an otherworldly intensity. The debt follows the bloodline, not the place. Better to face it here, where we at least know what to expect, than to die alone among strangers who won't understand what's happening. Sheriff Garcia, now haunted by ghosts and aged beyond his years by his failure to solve the previous disappearances, agreed to take Juan into protective custody for the week leading up to his birthday. This decision reflected both his genuine desire to save the boy and a professional need to finally unravel the mystery that was destroying his reputation and peace of mind. Juan was locked in the most secure cell in the county jail, a stone chamber with a single small window and a door. requiring separate keys to open. Two deputy sheriffs stood guard at all times, working in shifts to ensure Juan was never alone and no one could approach him without their knowledge. The cell was searched daily for objects that could be used for self-harm, and Juan's food was prepared and delivered by Sheriff Garcia's own wife to rule out any possibility of poisoning, but the precautions proved futile against whatever force was claiming the Moreno children with such methodical precision. On the morning of June 15, 1826, deputies Crawford and Murphy found Juan's cell empty, despite it being locked from the outside and the keys never leaving Sheriff Garcia's possession. The window was too small for a person to climb through. The walls showed no signs of damage or disturbance, and the floor bore no evidence of tunneling or escape attempts. Juan Moreno Jr. had simply vanished from a locked cell, leaving behind only his neatly folded clothing on the cot and a message scratched into the stone wall, presumably with his fingernails. The debt must be paid in full. Old blood remembers what new blood forgets. The scratches were deep and precise, made with a force no human fingernail could produce. This time, the search party didn't bother checking other locations or organizing extensive sweeps. The townspeople had learned to accept the impossible and went straight to the clearing by Loyal Hannah Creek with the grim certainty of people attending a funeral they had already witnessed twice. They found Juan exactly where they expected, lying peacefully in the center of the circle of dead grass, which was becoming ever more defined with each death. His 18-year-old body displayed the same impossible signs as his siblings: white eyes, a serene expression, and no medical explanation for his death. But Juan had left behind something the others hadn't. In his right hand he clutched a small scrap of parchment covered in symbols that resembled a mix of Spanish script and something far older and more primal. Dr. Lopez meticulously documented every detail of Juan's condition, noting that the dead circle had grown to nearly 20 feet in diameter and that strange plants had begun sprouting along its perimeter, species he couldn't recognize or identify. In any of his botanical references, when he tried to pry the parchment from Juan's hand to examine it closely, the paper crumbled to dust at his touch, leaving only faint traces of the strange symbols seared into the boy's palm as if branded there. Father Garcia, despite his previous reluctance and the physical distress caused by approaching Moreno deaths, forced himself to examine the marks on Juan's hand before the burial. He later wrote in his private journal that the symbols were older than Christ, older than Rome, older than anything that should exist on Christian soil inhabited by God-fearing people. The priest's journal entry continued. These signs speak of debts that transcend individual lives, of payments demanded by forces that recognize neither the authority of the church nor the state. I fear the Moreno family is ensnared in something that began long before their birth and will continue long after the last of them pays the same price as the others. Father Garcia burned his journal 3 days after writing those words, but not before making a copy, which he sealed in a metal box and hid in the cornerstone of the church. The copy remained undiscovered for over a century until a 1967 restoration finally uncovered these unsettling observations. The pattern of supernatural rejection continued at Juan's funeral. No Catholic priest could bring himself to perform the ceremony, and this time even Protestant ministers refused to participate, stating that the very air around the Moreno family seemed to resist their prayers and muffle their voices. Juan Sr. delivered the eulogy over his son's grave, but those present later noted that his voice had changed dramatically since Pedro's funeral 6 years earlier. It now carried an echo, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a deep well, and his words seemed to linger in the air longer than natural acoustics would allow. Isabella stood beside him, her graying hair now broader, her eyes entirely gray. She observed the proceedings with an expression that suggested she saw something beyond the visible world. After Juan's funeral, the nature of the whispers in Alhambra changed entirely. Where people had once speculated about possible rational Explanations, poisonings, diseases, hidden murders, or family madness. They now spoke quietly of curses, ancient debts, and forces that predated Christian settlement in Andalusia. The town's Protestant minister, Reverend William Laud, began researching the pre-colonial history of the Darro River Valley, spending his own funds to correspond with scholars at East Coast universities who specialized in Native American history and European folklore. What Reverend Laud uncovered in dusty archives and through meticulous interviews with elderly Moors living on New York reservations provided the first rational explanation for the supernatural events terrorizing his community. Though the truth he uncovered was far more unsettling than any wild theories the desperate townspeople had concocted to explain the impossible pattern of Moreno deaths. As June 15, 1829 approached, the day Carmen Moreno would turn 18, the town of Alhambra was gripped by a fear unlike anything in its brief but troubled history. Property values had collapsed to the point that entire neighborhoods stood empty, their windows boarded up and their yards overgrown with weeds. Businesses suffered losses at an alarming rate, customers avoided the town center, and nearly half the population had relocated to safer areas in neighboring counties. The exodus had begun gradually after Juan's death but accelerated rapidly as Carmen's 18th birthday approached. Families packed their belongings at night and left without saying goodbye to neighbors they had known for decades. The Moorish families left first, claiming Isabella Moreno had brought shame and supernatural danger to their entire community, followed soon by the German immigrants, muttering about old-world curses that had somehow followed them to the New World. Those who stayed did so either because they lacked the resources to relocate or because they felt a morbid compulsion to witness the conclusion of what everyone now considered a supernatural phenomenon that defied all laws of nature and reason. Sheriff Garcia had aged dramatically since failing to protect Juan. His hair had turned completely gray, and his hands trembled, making it difficult for him to write official reports. Dr. Lopez began keeping detailed records of every unusual occurrence in Alhambra, documenting strange animal behavior and unexplained illnesses, and a growing number of residents reporting disturbing dreams about white-eyed children calling from beyond the Darro River. His medical practice had all but collapsed. As people began attributing all ailments to supernatural causes rather than natural diseases, Carmen herself spent 3 years preparing for her fate with a composure that was both admirable and deeply unsettling. Unlike Juan, who had fought desperately against his destiny, she seemed to accept it with the same otherworldly calm as her mother. She spent her final months learning as much as she could about her family's history, questioning Isabella about their origins in Spain and the circumstances that had brought them to this valley in Andalusia. It was during these conversations that Isabella finally revealed the truth she had concealed for 25 years, sharing secrets that explained the supernatural force claiming her children and offering a glimpse into powers most 19th-century Americans couldn't even imagine. The revelations came gradually, shared during long evening conversations by the fireplace in their stone house, while the wind outside carried sounds that no longer seemed entirely natural. "The Moreno name is older than you think," Isabella told her daughter as they sat together in the living room, where the laughter of 5 children had once echoed. "We are not just Spanish immigrants seeking a better life in America. Our lineage carries a responsibility placed upon us centuries ago, debts that must be paid regardless of our personal wishes or aspirations." Isabella explained that their family descended from a line of Druids who had fled Spain during the English persecutions of the 17th century, carrying with them ancient knowledge and obligations that tied them to forces older than Christianity. Juan himself did not know the true origins of his wife, believing he had married a simple Catholic woman whose only unusual trait was her skill with herbs. "But the earth knows," Isabella continued, her gray eyes reflecting the firelight with such intensity that Carmen shuddered despite the warmth of the room. "The earth remembers every drop of blood spilled upon it, every injustice committed, every debt placed upon it. When we settled by the faithful Darrow River, I felt the pull immediately. The same force that guided our ancestors for generations called us here for a purpose. Carmen asked her mother why she had allowed the family to settle in a place she knew was tied to their ancient obligations. Why had she borne children, knowing the price they might have to pay? Isabella's response would haunt Carmen until her final days and shed light on the horrifying logic governing their supernatural predicament. Because the debt was not ours to create, but ours alone to pay, Isabella explained, our lineage carries the spiritual energy needed to balance an injustice committed nearly a century ago in this very valley. If we had tried to run, if we had refused our obligations, the debt would have followed us everywhere and demanded payment under circumstances far more horrific than those we've faced here. She revealed that their arrival in Alhambra was not accidental. They had been drawn to the valley by the same forces that had taken Pedro, Maria, and Juan. The supernatural pattern was not a random persecution, but a carefully orchestrated spiritual contract designed to restore balance where violence and injustice had disrupted the natural order of life and death. Each death strengthens the bond, Isabella told her daughter. Each child who pays this price brings us closer to fulfilling the obligation that will free those who remain from the ancient debt. When the final payment is made, when the last child joins their siblings in the world beyond this one, those who survive will be released from the chains that have bound our family for 3 centuries. As Carmen's 18th birthday approached, other strange phenomena began occurring in Alhambra, growing more frequent and intense. Residents reported hearing children's voices singing Spanish lullabies in the woods near Loyal Hannah Creek, though no children lived nearby. Animals refused to cross certain paths in town, creating invisible barriers that forced people to take long detours around previously unremarkable areas. The weather itself seemed to react to the approaching deadline. Temperatures fluctuated wildly from day to day, spring warmth giving way to sudden winter chills that killed early blooms and left icy formations resembling Celtic knots. The wind carried scents with no clear source, the smell of burning pyrotechnics, reminding older Spaniards of their homeland, and something else that smelled of ancient earth and very old bones. As we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Alhambra escalates to a degree that defies everything we think we know about nature. If this story unsettles you, share this video with a friend who loves grim mysteries. Like the video to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to catch more stories like this. Let's find out together what happens when Carmen Moreno meets the same fate as her 3 siblings on the morning of June 15, 1829. Carmen Moreno woke before dawn and donned her finest attire, a white dress that Isabella had spent months sewing in preparation for this day. The dress was unlike anything seen in Alhambra before. It blended traditional Spanish patterns with symbols that seemed to mix Celtic motifs with something far more primal and ancient. Instead of trying to flee or hide, as Juan had, Carmen spent her final hours visiting every remaining family in Alhambra, saying goodbye to the people who had watched her grow from a child into a young woman of remarkable grace and intelligence. Her visits were brief but memorable. She thanked each family for their kindness to the Morenos, apologized for any disruptions their supernatural predicament had caused the community, and left small gifts she had prepared over weeks. Her final stop was Dr. Lopez's home, where she asked him to promise to continue documenting her family's deaths, no matter how inexplicable they seemed to medical common sense. Someone must bear witness, she told him, her voice carrying the same otherworldly notes that had begun to affect her father's speech. Someone must remember that we lived, that we loved, that we were more than just the sum of this terrible pattern that consumed us. At 3:17 p.m., the exact time all her siblings had vanished, Carmen calmly walked out of Alhambra and headed toward Loyal Hannah Creek, following the path that had become as familiar to the town's people as the road to their own cemetery. Dozens of remaining residents followed at a respectful distance, forming a somber procession that stretched nearly a quarter-mile along the creek. The scene that unfolded at the clearing by Loyal Hannah Creek on June 15, 1829, would remain etched in the memory of every witness and become a story passed down through generations in Alhambra families like a shared nightmare that defied time. Carmen stepped into the clearing with the dignity of a young woman attending her own wedding, not her own death. The circle of dead grass, which had expanded with each previous death, now reached nearly 25 feet in diameter, its edges so geometrically perfect they seemed drawn with mathematical instruments. Along its perimeter grew strange plant species Dr. Lopez later identified as extinct in Andalusia for over a century. The gathered crowd watched in silence as Carmen walked to the very center of the clearing and knelt, her white dress fanning around her like the petals of a morning flower. She folded her hands in her lap and began speaking in a language that resembled Spanish, though some of the oldest Spaniards later claimed her words contained elements of languages far older than any they had ever heard. For 17 minutes, nothing visible happened. Carmen knelt in the center of the clearing, seemingly praying or meditating peacefully under the afternoon sun, her voice carrying across the valley in a rhythmic chant that seemed to harmonize with the wind rustling through the surrounding trees. The gathered crowd held their breath, some praying silently, others simply watching with a fascination that bordered on redefining their perception of reality. Then, at exactly 3:30 p.m., everyone present heard the same sound, a low, mournful wail that seemed to rise from the earth itself, as if the valley's voice were grieving another life taken by ancient justice. The sound was unlike anything they had ever heard, not animal, not human, but it carried echoes of sorrow, as if absorbing centuries of accumulated grief. As the wail faded, Carmen's body underwent the same transformation as her siblings. Her eyes became the familiar white, her face took on a serene expression as if she saw a beautiful dream, and her heart simply stopped beating. But unlike Pedro, Maria, and Juan, whose deaths were discovered after the fact, Carmen's passing occurred in the presence of witnesses who would remember her final moments for the rest of their lives. Carmen's death was even more unsettling, because her lips continued moving for nearly an hour after her heart stopped, silently mouthing words that several witnesses claimed they understood despite hearing no sound. Dr. Lopez, who was close enough to observe these final conversations, later reported that Carmen seemed to be speaking in multiple languages, Spanish, Arabic, and a language unlike any human tongue he had ever encountered. Several people in the crowd claimed they could decipher fragments of what she said. Apologies to the community for the disruptions caused by her family's situation, explanations about debts and obligations that transcended individual lives, and, most disturbingly, detailed descriptions of how and when young Juan Moreno would complete the pattern 5 years later. The supernatural phenomena accompanying Carmen's death were more intense than anything that had accompanied the previous tragedies. The circle of dead grass instantly expanded to 30 feet in diameter. Within this circle, the temperature dropped at least 20 degrees, forming visible frost that created intricate patterns resembling Celtic knots and symbols no one could identify. Even more disturbing were the shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources within the expanded circle. Witnesses reported seeing figures resembling children dancing around the kneeling Carmen. Yet, when they looked directly at these visions, they saw nothing but shifting patterns of light and shadow, painful to watch for more than a few seconds. Carmen Moreno's death marked a turning point in Alhambra's supernatural siege, escalating far beyond the familiar order established by the previous deaths. Unlike the earlier tragedies, which were followed by periods of relative quiet, Carmen's passing seemed to amplify the presence of the otherworldly force that had gripped the valley, as if her death had opened a gateway allowing forces from beyond the physical world to exert greater influence on the living. Over the following weeks, residents reported phenomena that defied all rational explanations their practical minds could devise. Animals across the valley began behaving contrary to their natural instincts. House cats refused to hunt mice. Dogs howled incessantly during the day, and horses would only move in perfectly straight lines, refusing to follow winding roads or paths that might lead them toward the clearing by Loyal Hannah Creek. The weather grew increasingly unpredictable and unnatural. Rain fell in geometric patterns, leaving some areas completely dry while others, just feet away, were drenched. Snow fell on warm days and melted upward rather than downward, creating visual effects that made witnesses question their sanity. Most disturbing was the sound of children's laughter emanating from the clearing in the darkest hours of the night, accompanied by music resembling traditional Spanish dance tunes played on instruments that produced melodies unlike anything heard in the material world. Juan Moreno, who had maintained stoic composure after losing 3 children, finally broke after Carmen's funeral. 3 days later, neighbors found him in his workshop, methodically destroying all his metal work. His hands were blooded from pounding his fists against the anvil where his children had once learned their father's trade. The tools that had been his pride and livelihood lay bent and broken across the workspace, transformed into abstract sculptures of grief and rage. When Dr. Lopez examined Juan, he found that the man's eyes had taken on the same grayish hue as his wife's, and he spoke only in fragmented phrases about paying debts and finishing what had been started. His voice carried the same otherworldly echo that had begun affecting his speech at Juan Jr.'s funeral, but now the effect was so pronounced it seemed as if his words came from multiple sources at once, as though he were speaking in harmony with voices from other dimensions. Isabella underwent an even more striking transformation. The gray streak in her hair had spread, and now her entire head was silver, while her eyes had faded to such a pale gray that in certain lights they appeared almost colorless, like windows. Looking into an empty sky, she stopped speaking Spanish entirely, communicating only in rapid Arabic that was difficult to understand even for other Spanish families in Alhambra. She spent entire days sitting by Carmen's grave, holding animated conversations with the headstone as if receiving detailed responses to her questions and remarks. Those brave enough to approach reported that she seemed to be discussing practical matters, household management, family finances, and preparations for what she called the final payment. Indeed, the conversation suggested she was receiving instructions from the other side about how to prepare for young Juan's 18th birthday and the completion of the supernatural process that had so methodically claimed her children. As the months passed, the surviving Moreno family members grew increasingly distant from Alhambra's remaining population. Juan abandoned his workshop entirely, and the fire that had burned continuously for over 20 years finally went out, leaving the stone building silent and empty, like a monument to a vanished way of life. Young Juan, then 15 and acutely aware that he had 3 years left until his 18th birthday, began exhibiting symptoms that went far beyond ordinary childhood fear of death. During this period, he aged rapidly. Gray streaks appeared in his dark hair and wrinkles formed around his eyes, making him appear decades older than his years. His voice also changed, taking on the same resonant quality as his parents', though in his case, it produced almost musical harmonies. The boy sometimes went days without sleep, claiming that when he closed his eyes, he saw his siblings calling to him from the clearing by the creek, showing him glimpses of the world they now inhabited and describing the role he would play in fulfilling their family's supernatural obligations when exhaustion finally forced him to rest. Neighbors reported hearing him hold detailed conversations with invisible companions throughout the night, discussions that seemed to involve complex negotiations about the timing, circumstances, and nature of the final payment that would settle the ancient debt once and for all. It was during this period of escalating supernatural activity that Reverend Mlaud made a discovery that provided the first comprehensive explanation for the events that had plagued Alhambra for nearly a decade. Years of painstaking research into the pre-colonial history of the Loyal Hannah Creek Valley finally bore fruit, yielding answers that were both illuminating and deeply unsettling. Working with scholars from East Coast universities and conducting Meticulous interviews with elderly Moors living on New York reservations, Maud uncovered the historical foundation upon which the Moreno family's supernatural obligations were built. This discovery forever altered the townspeople's understanding of their valley and the forces governing life and death within its borders. In 1754, nearly a century before the Moreno family's arrival in Andalusia, a group of Scottish Spanish settlers established a temporary camp by Loyal Hannah Creek while scouting locations for permanent settlements. The camp was attacked by warriors from a Moorish tribe who considered the presence of Europeans a desecration of sacred land used for spiritual ceremonies for generations. The attack left 17 colonists dead, but before their demise, the settlers managed to capture 5 tribal warriors, including a young shaman named Gasuda, who was said to possess extraordinary spiritual abilities that connected him directly to the forces governing nature. In fear and rage, the colonists executed all 5 captives in the clearing by the creek, believing that eliminating the group's spiritual leader would prevent future attacks. According to oral traditions collected by Maud from Moorish elders, Gasuda used his final moments to pronounce a curse on the valley, one that would claim 5 lives in retribution for the deaths of the 5 Moors, but only after the right bloodline settled on the cursed land and the spiritual conditions for collecting the ancient debt were met. Maud learned that the curse was not merely vengeance, but an act of restoring spiritual balance to a place where sacred land had been desecrated and innocent blood spilled through ignorance and fear. The 5 deaths would provide the spiritual energy needed to heal the supernatural wound inflicted on the valley, allowing the souls of the executed Moors to find peace and removing the barrier between the physical and spiritual worlds created by their unjust deaths. The final act of the Moreno family's tragedy began not on June 15, 1832, but 3 days earlier when 15-year-old Juan Moreno vanished from his family's stone house under circumstances that differed starkly from his siblings' disappearances. Unlike Pedro, Maria, Juan Jr., and Carmen, who vanished the moment they turned 18, Juan seemed to have been claimed early by the supernatural forces that had stalked his bloodline for over a decade. The search for Juan followed a pattern that was both familiar and strikingly different from the previous disappearances. Instead of organizing search parties, the few remaining residents of Alhambra seemed resigned to the fact that the boy was beyond saving, that whatever force had taken the Moreno children had accelerated its process for reasons that made sense. Only in the context of the supernatural justice governing their situation, only Juan Sr. and Isabella searched for their youngest son, spending 3 days and 3 nights calling his name through the hills and valleys of Westmoreland County, while their former neighbors watched from behind curtained windows, too frightened to offer help but too fascinated to look away entirely. The couple moved through the landscape like ghosts, their voices carrying through the valley with the same otherworldly echo that had begun to affect their speech after Carmen's death. On the morning of June 15th, the day that would have been Juan's 18th birthday had he lived to see it, his parents found him in the clearing by Loyal Hannah Creek, but his condition was unlike anything they had seen with his siblings. Juan stood upright in the center of the circle of dead grass, which had now expanded to nearly the size of the clearing. His arms were raised to the sky, and his lips moved as if chanting an ancient incantation or prayer that harmonized with sounds emanating from the earth itself. His eyes bore the familiar whiteness of his dead siblings, but unlike them, he was still breathing, still moving, still somehow alive, despite all the supernatural signs that had accompanied the deaths of Pedro, Maria, Juan Jr., and Carmen. The transformation had begun but not completed, leaving Juan in a liminal state between life and death, defying all laws of nature. Isabella approached her son cautiously, speaking to him in the Arabic that had become her native tongue after Carmen's funeral, using tender words and phrases from his childhood, trying to reach whatever remained of his consciousness amid the Supernatural transformation claiming him. Juan turned at the sound of her voice, and for a moment his white eyes seemed to focus on her face with an intensity that suggested he could still see her despite the otherworldly change that had overtaken his vision. Her voice carried the echo of the valley itself, harmonizing with sounds that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. Juan spoke his final words, "The debt is paid, Mother. The old ways return, the earth will remember what it was before. The strangers came, 5 are now gathered, and the circle closes as it was meant to." At exactly 3:17 p.m., the same time each of his siblings had vanished from the material world, Juan Moreno's heart stopped beating. But unlike Pedro, Maria, Juan Jr., and Carmen, whose bodies collapsed to the ground at the moment of death, Juan remained standing in the center of the clearing, his arms still raised to the sky. His face was turned toward the June sun, which had already witnessed for deaths in this cursed place. The transformation of the clearing began immediately and was far more dramatic than anything that had accompanied the previous deaths. The circle of dead grass, which had grown with each prior tragedy, suddenly sprouted new growth, not the familiar flora of Andalusia that once covered the area, but plants that had not existed in the valley for over a century. Wild rice, chrysanthemum, cinquefoil, and other plants sacred to the Moorish people pushed through the soil as if summoned by Juan's final breath, creating a garden belonging to another era and another understanding of humanity's relationship with nature. The plants grew at a supernatural pace, reaching full maturity within hours and forming patterns that, when viewed from the surrounding hills, created recognizable symbols. Juan Sr. and Isabella remained in the clearing until sunset, standing beside their son's body and watching as the supernatural transformations continued around them, reshaping the landscape in homage to spiritual traditions that had existed in the valley long before Europeans arrived. As darkness fell, witnesses from the town reported seeing lights dancing among the trees around Loyal Hannah Creek, not the warm yellow glow of lanterns or torches, but a cold blue-white shimmer of willow, the wisp, or spectral energy that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. By morning, Juan Sr. and Isabella Moreno were dead. Their bodies were found lying at their son's feet, as if they had knelt in prayer before his standing form and simply chosen to join him in whatever realm existed beyond the physical world. Dr. Lopez, who performed the final examinations of his career on the remaining Moreno family members, found no cause of death for the parents. Their hearts had simply stopped beating simultaneously at some point in the night, as if their life force had voluntarily surrendered to complete the supernatural act that had claimed their children. The funerals for the final 3 Moreno family members drew visitors from as far away as Madrid and Barcelona, including newspaper reporters, spiritualists, investigators, and the merely curious, all hoping to document the conclusion of what had become known across Andalusia as the Alhambra curse. Major newspaper representatives arrived to cover what they expected to be the final chapter of a story that had captured the imagination of readers across the eastern United States. But when the funeral procession reached the clearing to retrieve the bodies for burial, they found only Juan still standing in the center of the supernatural garden that had grown around him. Juan Sr. and Isabella had vanished as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind only their clothing and a lingering scent of burnt sage that reminded witnesses of rural Spain's marshes and carried associations with ancient rituals and older ways of understanding the connection between life and death. Juan's body was finally carried to the town cemetery, where he was buried beside his siblings' graves. The ceremony drew witnesses from across Andalusia and neighboring states. But even in death, he continued to defy the laws of nature, affirming the supernatural nature of everything that had transpired over the past 16 years. The headstone on Juan's grave cracked down the middle a week after it was installed, splitting his name into 2 equal parts along a perfectly straight line. Every attempt to replace the damaged stone resulted in the same supernatural destruction, with new headstones developing identical cracks within days of installation. Eventually, the cemetery authorities gave up and left Juan's grave unmarked, though visitors to the site note that it remains clearly visible today. The grass grows in a perfect spiral, visible from hundreds of feet away, and continues to grow regardless of weather conditions or seasonal changes. The town of Alhambra never recovered from the 16-year ordeal that befell the Moreno family and transformed their peaceful valley into a place where the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds was forever altered. By 1835, over three-quarters of the population had relocated to other parts of Andalusia, abandoning homes and businesses they had built over decades to avoid living in a place where such impossible events could occur. Those who remained found themselves in a community haunted not only by memories of supernatural terror but also by the constant presence of forces that seemed to have awakened after the Moreno's demise. The clearing by Loyal Hannah Creek became a pilgrimage site for spiritualists, investigators, and the curious from around the world. However, local authorities eventually cordoned off the area after several visitors reported temporary blindness, hearing voices in unknown languages, and, in 3 documented cases, developing the same condition that afflicted the Moreno children. Reverend Maud's research papers, discovered in the Protestant Church after his death in 1841, provided the most comprehensive explanation for the events that had plagued Alhambra for nearly 2 decades. According to his final writings, Gasuda's curse had indeed been fulfilled with the deaths of the 5 Moreno siblings, but its completion did not result in supernatural vengeance against European settlers, as some tribal oral traditions had suggested. Instead, Maud, drawing on his extensive correspondence with Moorish elders and his study of pre-Christian Celtic traditions, theorized that the spiritual energy harvested from the Moreno's deaths was used not for destruction but for healing, restoring the natural balance disrupted by violence and cultural misunderstanding. Over a century earlier, the transformation of the clearing into a sanctuary for native plant species, the peaceful nature of all 5 deaths despite their supernatural circumstances, and the voluntary reunion of Juan Sr. and Isabella with their offspring suggested that the curse had transcended its original purpose into something more complex and, ultimately, more merciful than mere retribution. The Moreno family records were sealed by court order in 1837 and remained locked in the Westmoreland County Courthouse until 1975, when they were finally released to researchers studying patterns of unexplained deaths in rural Andalusia. By then, the clearing by Loyal Hannah Creek had become part of a state nature preserve, and the supernatural phenomena that once terrorized the valley had become part of local folklore and a subject of academic curiosity. But the questions raised by the Moreno family's fate continue to challenge our understanding of the forces governing life and death, justice and retribution, extending beyond rational explanation. How could 5 healthy children die on the same day, at the same time of day, in the same place, with no medical explanation for their deaths? What force could orchestrate such a precise pattern of supernatural justice over nearly 2 decades? And most disturbingly, how many other families might carry similar debts, incurred by ancestors they never knew, in places they've never been, for crimes they didn't commit? The story of the Moreno family reminds us that some obligations transcend a single lifetime, that actions taken in one generation can echo across centuries, demanding payment from those who never knew they owed anything at all. They paid a price set long before their birth, on land their ancestors didn't know, for injustices they didn't commit but which their bloodline was somehow destined to balance. This mystery shows us that the past is never truly past, that the earth beneath our feet remembers everything that has happened upon it, and that sometimes the only way to heal old wounds is through sacrifices that seem impossibly cruel to those required to make them. What do you think of this story? Do you believe ancient curses can reach across centuries to claim modern victims? Was there a rational explanation for the impossible deaths that took 5 children on their 18th birthdays? Could the Moreno family have escaped their fate by making different choices, or were they bound by forces too powerful for human will to overcome? Leave your comment below and tell us what you think really happened in the mountains of Western Andalusia. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more exploring the dark corners of American history, subscribe, hit the bell, and share with anyone who loves mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about the world. See you in the next video.